a zone. For the European subject, to stand on the threshold of several worlds and of several cultures allows a potential simultaneity of belongings and opens up the possibility of crossing over in as many different directions, as actually illustrated by the experience of translation. In his 1923 essay on translation, Walter Benjamin is using one image which, among others, relates to the semantic field of threshold. However, unlike a literary work, a translation doesn't find itself, so to speak, in the middle of the high forest of the language itself. Instead, from outside it, facing it, and without entering it, translation calls to the original within, at that one point where the echo in its own language can produce a reverberation of the foreign language's work. Such an irreductive exteriority means, in other terms, that the translation stands on the threshold of the original. This metaphor is supported and justified by two main tenets of Walter Benjamin thinking on translation. The first one is expressed in his 1916 essay on language. Translation is a removal from one language into another through a continuum of transformation. Translation passes through continua of transformation, not abstract areas of identity and similarity. What's very interesting here is that Verwandlung, the German word used here by Walter Benjamin for transformation, is what Franz Kafka will use in the Metamorphosis. It's exactly the same word. And then we can think about Franz Kafka's character as a symbol of the translator, being on the threshold of human life and on the threshold of animal life. Such a continuum does create a zone. The concept taken in Walter Benjamin's definition when he says the threshold is a Schwelle, is a zone. So such a continuum does create a zone. The concept taken in Walter Benjamin's definition, that is a non-limited space encompassing and constituted by a series of thresholds, to always stand on the threshold, potentially holding a bilateral opening so that a language shall always be on the threshold of another one, and vice versa. The second tenet is given in the last sentence of Walter Benjamin's essay on translation, which prove its importance. The quote is very known. The interlinear version of the Holy Scriptures is a prototype or ideal of all translation. In such a display, each line forms a threshold for the other one, like the drawing lines in Escher's representation, where the viewer is not able to make a distinction between here black and white figures. The black ones are on the threshold of the white ones, and the white one on the threshold of the black ones, but they are together. For Walter Benjamin, as we know, a translation that seeks to transmit something can transmit nothing other than a message, that is, something inessential. The goal of the translative process for Walter Benjamin is not to transfer meaning, but to put together languages, like here, these figures put together, through the agency of a human subject whose subjectivity lays in the matricial hollowness of their encounter. The correlated notion of threshold and of translation have the power to subvert the oppositional logic of inside-outside. It's necessary to undermine such a logic because this is the only way to bring a rough answer to the question, How does one prevent, let's say, a French person to regard a Spanish person as a foreigner while recognizing, accepting, and respecting his or her alterity? Such a dialectical tension between closeness and remoteness, between proximity and distance, defines European identity and the translative belonging patterns it induces. By virtue of both being Europeans, both the Spanish and the French could see in the other one a portrait which is not their own, but could have been. As European, each could see in the other's dissimilarity a possible resemblance. Europe is nothing else than a laboratory for such experiments in identity. The question of the borders of Europe, essential for its identity, has been so debated that it could put off any attempt to tackle it again. Presently, to compare the European Union 27 member states or the Council of Europe 47 member states with the 51 countries having entered the Eurovision competition, or with the 53 national associations which take part in the European Football Championship, could be appealing but surely baffling. Calling it a one-size-fits-all Europe is not good enough. Its expansibility calls for a conceptually more satisfying designation. And I will propose, borrowing from Zygmunt Bauman terminology, to name it a liquid Europe. Liquidity hinting at a dimension of space irreducible to mere material topography. A liquid Europe. How then will we term the spatial condition fitting a liquid Europe? Where to find the appropriate notion for a European cultural identity not defined by strict borders but by thresholds? Territory? Space? Well, a territory implies limits. A space claims a neutral semantic value. We need a more suitable signifier to label such a space, shaped by displacement and not merely hosting them. A space where the European spirit will freely blow, ignoring national signposts and local markers. Before Walter Benjamin, the French poet Apollinaire made use of the notion of zone. The year 1913 saw the publication of the poem Zone, which will become the opening poem of Alcool, one of the founding books of European modern poetry. In a disenchanted Paris, the poet, Apollinaire, calls upon powers coming from outside, be it the fervor of Christian religion, the sky opened by the first airplanes, images from Africa, America or China, memories from childhood and from travels in Europe, the vision of Jewish migrants' misery. And here is a cover of the translation of Zone by Samuel Beckett. A nice illustration of the European translation zone, isn't it? Using the word zone is not easy because of its ambivalent semantic. It covers a wide zone of meanings set around two signifying poles. One of them draws together designation of regions cut out on earth or in the sky, as well as restricted territories marked by specific activities or precise regulation. The other one relates to urban surroundings or undeveloped areas whose vagueness goes together with an idea of uncertain boundaries and with a threatening nature associated to margins. While generally the lexicon of the army, of geography, of economy understands the notion of zone in a technical, limited sense, imagination tends to make out of this social reality a setting for staging transgressive pulsions. As far as Brussels Europe is concerned, the first meaning is prevalent, and Eurozone or Schengen zone are used to describe vigilantly scrutinized and regulated spaces. How could we reconcile the two perceptions, the strictly ruled zone and the wild zone? Commonly used expressions like border zone or limit zone demonstrate that the semantic ambivalence could produce a valuable signification. The word zone is indeed quite convenient to play out the opposition inside-outside while tuning down its conceptual antagonism. Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe are still being employed in the sense of zones in order to neutralize a precise and potentially challenging geopolitical reality these European regions are engaged with. However, diplomacy hardly explains the success of the notion of zone, recently enjoyed in social sciences and humanities, mainly due to two influential texts, one by Marie-Louise Pratt, the other one by Emily Apter. In her 1991 article, Arts of the Contact Zone, Pratt defines contact zones as, quote, social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in context of highly asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism, slavery, or their aftermath, as they are lived out in many parts of the world today. End of quote. To grapple. To grapple is an interesting verb for its two significations, to hold or to struggle, underlining the duality inherent in the notion of contact zone, to hold or to struggle. A confrontation which could have negative effects, as in colonial situations, or positive ones, like in the multicultural fabric of contemporary societies, that being a consequence very often of the first situation. A most interesting aspect in Pratt's grasp of the notion is a demographic element. In a viewpoint, a zone is not an unpopulated location, but a space shaped by the human relationship it is hosting. The zone area begins to exist according to the contacts which are taking place within. Thus, she starts by evoking the Spanish colonization in Peru through a text written in the 17th century to the King of Spain by bilingual literate men of Indian descent, and then goes on in depicting a classroom community experience on multiculturalism, that is a course focusing on the Americas and their multiple cultural histories, which attracted students from many different backgrounds. Both are considered by Pratt as contact zones. The flag chosen for the European Union adequately exemplifies the idea. The choice of a strictly symbolic mode of representation and the refusal to match the number of stars with the number of member states do show an understanding of Europe as a zone, which nature doesn't call for any kind of structural realism. This will appear clearly from the comparison with the Dutch architect's Rem Koolhaas proposal, which, besides the fact it reminds of an image associated with supermarket technology, the barcode, claims to objectify a supposedly measurable space. Walter Benjamin Passagenwerk follows a methodology which Benjamin explained in a section entitled On the Theory of Knowledge. Quote, this work, Passagenwerk, the book of passages of arcades, this work has to develop to the highest degree the art of quoting without quotation mark. Its theory is intimately related to that of montage. End of quote. Now, the space created through a montage, be it pictorial, literary, musical, or cinematic, doesn't relate to geometric planning, since it comes out of the gathering of elements, hence it could be regarded as a zone of knowledge. Such a pattern of knowledge and thinking is adopted by Emily Apter in her book, The Translation Zone, in which she goes beyond Pratt's eloge of diversity to reflect on language wars and the balance of power in the production of world culture. Nothing is translatable, everything is translatable. Those two sentences are providing the, I'm quoting, the poles of her translation theory. Their apparent aporetic juxtaposition shed light on a choice of the notion of the zone, which stand as an, quoting, an intellectual topography, to mediate between the closeness of national boundaries and the limitlessness of a globalized world. The zone helps her to designate sites that are in translation, that is to say, belonging to no single discrete language or single medium of communication. End of quote. The paradigmatic value of such an understanding of zone allows her to put together analyses on different topics, from literature to war and technology, related to individual subjects as well as to communities. Such lines of thinking help to conceive of the zone as a mobile territory, a territory which is moving and which moves its boundaries, a space born out of the movement it is hosting, defined not by its limits, but by its function and its capacities. Similar to the tenets grounding Benjamin's methodology, the principle defining the zone will perceive it as a space devoid of a transcendental axiom of continuity connecting its components, but a space designed by their concomitants. This allows us to draw a political application. In Europe, figured out as a zone, the European subject always stands on the threshold of the other European subject. His or her European dimension exists only in connection with the other European subject's identity, which therefore waits to be translated. This has a name in European policies, doesn't it? Multilingualism. One of the notions the official EU discourse is defending with so much vigor. Now, on the European market of common ideas, translation and multilingualism seems to be linked by a high degree of compatibility. Is such a presentation a reality or an ideological twist? A philosophical perspective will notice the divergence in conceptual value of the prefixes trans and multi, and will lead to a much more cautious conclusion regarding the peaceful coexistence of translation and multilingualism. Trans involves a crossing over, the possibility of an encounter, of a mutual fertilization. Multi is only an indication, the reality of a supposed diversity. So what's the real connection between the two notions? A look at the Directorate General of Translation web pages will give us a precious insight into the role of translation and its link with multilingualism as understood by the European Union. First, multilingualism, that's from the web page from the DGT. Multilingualism, working definition, an individual's ability to communicate in several different languages, the coexistence of different languages, communities in one geographical political area, an organization policy choice to operate in more than one language. And then, multilingualism is a fact of life in the European Union and one of the founding principles of the EU institutions. At DG Translation, our job is to turn that principle into reality. And then, translation services. A multilingual organization like the EU needs high-quality translation and relies on professional linguists to keep it running smoothly. The role of the language services in the various EU institutions and bodies is to support and strengthen multilingual communication in Europe and to help Europeans understand EU policies.